and on the extreme right is Cyrene Siriwardhana. She is a policy and advocacy manager of Oxfam. So by now you already know the guidelines that go on in these parallel sessions, and which is that I will give each of the panelists 6 minutes. At the end of 5 minutes, a green flag would be shown, and at the end of 6 minutes, then a red flag will be shown, and I would request the speakers to speak to their time limit. When I was invited to moderate this session, first of all, of course, I'm always pleased when a conference puts a panel on gender disparities. And I thought that this particular panel is important because if the goal of this summit is towards a stronger, dynamic and inclusive South Asia, then you need to address gender disparities, otherwise you are not going to be able to make either a stronger or a more dynamic and certainly not a more inclusive South Asia. So I think this is very appropriate to have a panel such as this one. We also know that for the last 40 years, nationally and internationally, we have been talking about addressing this major challenge of gender disparities. In 1970, Esther Bosra wrote her and published her very seminal book on women in economic development, women's role in economic development. Before that, people never thought that women play any economic role. And in 1975, United Nations declared 10 years, the next 10 years, 75 to 85, as the decade of women and development. And since then, of course, we had 4 international women's conferences in Mexico, Copenhagen, Nairobi, and then Beijing in 1995. In every country, and including in South Asia, governments have adopted policies, especially targeting women. And also there are ministries, there are lots of plans and various projects to promote women's empowerment. Policies have been, initially the policies were more focused on women specific, and more since Beijing in 1995, we have been talking about mainstreaming gender, which means that in every issue has a gender dimension, and so that one needs to then put women into all the, you need to address every issue to see whether there would be a separate, differentiated impact on men and women, and whether in terms of policies you need to, do that, address this. Talking about, in the last 40 years, we have made progress. It is not that we have not made progress. In terms of education and health indicators, I think the gender gaps have been reduced globally and also in South Asia and within each country in South Asia. But there are certain areas where I think progress had been very slow, and that is in terms of income. For instance, women are still relegated in low, the informal sectors of the economy or low wage kinds of jobs. In terms of decision making, globally, also in South Asia and also within each of our countries, women's participation and voice is very low. That is one area where progress has been slow. And then I think violence against women, gender-based violence, that I think is not really reducing globally or South Asia or within each country. And in fact, I was looking at statistics in Sweden, that we find that even in Sweden, there has not been that much of a reduction in terms of violence against women. So that this particular problem is, I think, is very hard to get a grip at. in the Nordic countries, I think they generally follow a certain rule, which is called 60-40 gender balance, which means that for every job or every policy that they want to see the participation of both men and women, and they try to see that it should not be, it could be either men or women, but that the ratio should be 60-40. But I think in South Asia, and certainly I think in this conference, what I find, and but certainly in this panel, we are not maintaining a 60-40 kind of a ratio. It is very overwhelmingly women, both amongst the participants and also in the audience. And also, I regret to say that in this particular conference and the summit, when I looked at all the various panels, there again I found that mostly men and elderly men are sitting up there giving us lectures and things that we have been very used to for the last 40 years. So I've been wondering, so what has changed? So I hope one of our recommendations would be that it is true that women, the pat answer would be there are not that many women economists, we are economists and we cannot find economists. But I think that if really the goal is to really go with this 60-40, this gender balance, then you would really look very hard and try to meet that goal. So the main question is reaching that goal one of the priorities or not? I would not want to take too much more time, and I think what I thought I will do is, everybody has been given some questions. I would ask each of the participants one question, and I would request the panelists then to just be very specific and highlight one particular issue, and just not talk about problems and challenges, but also if can suggest some action to address this particular problem. So my first question is to Aradhna Agrawal, and the question I have for her is that just in the preceding panel we heard all this debate about the growth and versus inequity and things of that sort. And so I would ask Aradhna that first of all, should we have this kind of a debate about whether we will have just growth and not be concerned about inequality, disparity, in this case gender disparity. And secondly, if we are concerned about gender disparity, is growth going to be enough to really address this particular concern that we have? So Aradhna, over to you.
Thank you, Rounaq. And I would also like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak in this session. And let me just take up, this is a very interesting question, and I would really like to cite my research, which I've done recently on Kerala, which is the fastest growing state in India. And this state is also number one in terms of human development indicators. In fact, some of the human development indicators are quite comparable with Nordic countries, the region that she was referring to. Now, in that state, which is the fastest growing, where the human development indicators are so well developed, what is the situation of women? And that actually is indicating, that is basically the answer or response to her question, that growth alone is not really sufficient to address these questions of these gender disparities. In this state, what I found was that this in terms of education, this state is number one in terms of women education. And if you look at the gender parity in education, it is much above 1 for all levels of education, not only primary or secondary, but also for higher education. The numbers are given which show that women are more than 70% of the total enrollment in higher education is by women. So that shows that how much education, how much empowered these women are in terms of educational attainment. Now, obviously and also the rate of growth has been above 8% throughout, so the state is growing at a very fast rate. So both the things are happening, and in terms of health, again, these women are really, because the basic indicators of health are, of course, basic indicators I'm talking about, they're very strong. But let us look at the depth, what is actually happening. So let us look at some of the, we looked at some of the, indicators. We looked at awareness, of course. Awareness means in terms of education and in terms of, holding saving account decisions and all those things, which we found were very good, very favorable. But then what about other indicators in terms of mobility, in terms of domestic violence and crime against women, and in terms of economic participation and decision making within households? Kerala ranks the lowest in the country. Now, this was something which was amazing. We compared Kerala's standing. We used National Family Health Surveys, and we also used employment surveys, which happen in India after every 5 years. And we found that in terms of all these indicators, Kerala was at the bottom, almost at the bottom of the country. In fact, the crime rate has been the highest against women. Domestic violence has been the highest against women, and it is found that these are domestic, this crime, overall crime rate is the highest, and this is essentially because of domestic violence and sexual harassment and sex related crimes. So this is really something which one has to look into. And then health, basic health parameters are very good if you take, but if you go deeper, you find that the incidence of mental health, mental illness, that is really very serious with women. And there are several other issues which are like, breast cancer, incidence of breast cancer is very high in the state, and there are other parameters like, this mortality rate, maternal mortality rate is very high. So if you go to those disaggregated finer indicators, you find that all is not well, and there is growing incidence of drinking amongst women because of mental problems and because of loneliness, and all these things are happening in the state. So now, this was really worrisome, and then we sat down to think what to do, because for this study, this study was done for the State Planning Board of Kerala, and we were supposed to write a strategy for the challenges that the state is facing. So what to write, we looked at the literature, several measures. She was talking about gender mainstreaming, that is a very important thing. But let me just highlight a few things which actually I would, because my time is very limited here. So of course, what we have suggested several steps, but let me just highlight a few ones. Gender sensitization at early stage. It's very important that society understands, it's not merely an issue of women empowerment, but it is also an issue of understanding the gender. They should understand, they should actually know about each other. So, and it should happen at an early age. So, and that should be included, that should be a part of, our course curriculum. That is very important. And, whatever you understand in the childhood, that actually you carry forward throughout your life. So the first impressions are very important. And normally I find that students learn more in schools and educational institutions. So this is very important that we actually include some. Now a second point which is related with economic empowerment. What I found during this research was that domestic violence was negatively related with economic empowerment of women. That is, the more productive assets they hold, the lesser is the violence. So that is the kind of relationship that we found. So we actually propose that there has to be domestic empowerment. And here I would like to refer to this IDRC. They are in fact going ahead with gender empowerment, and they have raised certain questions which I would like to really talk about. And they actually are focusing on women empowerment while dealing with gender issues. And there are three themes for research for which they are calling for proposals. And these are like, what are the nature and magnitude of barriers to women's economic empowerment and to closing gender gaps in earnings and productivity. What we found was that there is, we used actually Oxasa blinder test, and we found just 1 minute. And we found that there is this wage discrimination. The discrimination, the difference between wage between men and women was not due to education, because educational attainments are higher for women. this was due to wage discrimination. So that was actually very serious for us. So this is what we have to see, and then what type of growth pattern should be there, so that there is positive growth for women, and how this women empowerment can affect economic growth. So mainstreaming of gender issues with growth. That is what is very important in your this thing, that it has to be. And just one
and
point.
Concluding remark.
Just concluding remark is that in Kerala itself there is a program. Actually, I have more to say, because I just wanted to say that there should be some development goals set by South Asia. So there should be some South Asian goals for women empowerment. So we should identify. My second is that we should identify the leading practices in this region and also abroad, and see how we can adopt them. One practice that I would like to, if somebody is interested, I can talk that in detail, but I am just mentioning one scheme that is there already in Kerala, which is called Kutumba Shri. Kutumba means family and Shri means prosperity. And this scheme actually is about women's self-help groups and how they are organized at 3 layers, and how they are empowering the women in terms of entrepreneurship, microfinancing, and political power.
Thank you very much. Aradhna. I'm sure that we will get a chance to come back to many of these issues later in the discussion. But I must say that I am a little crushed by this. Kerala used to be a model for all of us, and now to see that Kerala, with this high incidence of education and health, is still having all these problems with women and their mental health. One of the issues, and maybe the next speaker can address this, I think this has been a concern for many of us, is that we talk about women's labor force participation and all of that. Globally, I mean, women labor force participation has increased, but as I said, that wages, that part has not been addressed. Income is low, and secondly, women are getting more overworked, because I mean, they are now participating more and more in employment outside, but there is really the care economy where women are. That part, there is no public sector institutions, helping them there, or the old family structures are not helping them. So that no wonder that women are getting more and more depressed, because they are, if they had 48-hour days, and some rest, that would have been easier. Anyway, now our next speaker is Nisha Arunathilake, and I think again Sri Lanka, like Kerala, Sri Lanka again had been out there from the early 70s compared to all other South Asian countries. Sri Lanka's social indicators, life expectancy, education, everything was much higher in Sri Lanka, and even labor force participation. So what really are 2-3 main challenges still for in terms of gender disparities that one needs to address in Sri Lanka, and how do you address that then?
Okay, yes, thank you. Actually, IPS was involved in doing the second National Human Development Report for Sri Lanka last year, and one main finding in that report is that, as you said very correctly, that we do very well in terms of Human Development Index, even inequality adjusted Human Development Index. We have the best indicator in the SAARC region, and also our dimensional poverty rates are very low, it's only 4.7%. But despite all of that, in terms of the gender inequality index, we are not doing too well. We are sort of in the mid-range. Actually, Bangladesh and Nepal is doing better than us.
So why so?
Yes, why so? So if you go deeply into the different indicators, which is what the gender inequality index is composed of, we can see that, as you say, part of that is to do with health and education. Again, in health and education, Sri Lanka is doing quite well. Even tertiary education, access to tertiary education, females are doing better than males. For example, about 14% of females are in tertiary education, have attained tertiary education, but only about 13% of males. The main areas where the inequality is coming out is in labor force participation and in parliamentary representation of females. Now, there is a sort of agreement internationally that you need to have about 30%, 40%, or 30% of females in parliament. But in Sri Lanka, it's only about 6%. So out of 225 parliamentarians, we have only 13 women. And that's at the national level. At the subnational levels, it's even worse. In urban councils and town councils, it's about 3% females. And Pradesh Sabhas, it's even less. So some of the reasons is that actually females are not nominated in the electoral lists. So for example, we looked at the 2004 elections, the list.
It is proportional representation.
Yeah. In across all the parties, only about 5% of females were even nominated for election. So it's not a big surprise that not very many people get elected. And even of the ones who are nominated, actually voters even do not prefer to vote, even the females prefer to vote for males and not for females.
And
so
Sri Lanka had the first woman prime minister in South Asia, Selima Ahmed. And then she was followed by her daughter, who was the prime minister and also president of the country.
So despite all of that, so part of the reason is actually the females also don't select into, they are not interested in politics. Partly also the political culture has also changed. You know, you need to have money and some muscle power to be a politician in the country at the moment. But it is also, it's the competition is high. I mean, it is also, while you saw today at this conference, you see more adult older males in the panels than females and younger people. So part of the same reasons are there in drawing up the electoral lists as well. That is one reason. The second reason is the labor force participation. Although you said that it is good in Sri Lanka, it's actually one of the reasons why the gender inequality index is low, because we have only 33%, about 34% of females are participating economically, and more interestingly, that proportion has not changed in the last 20 years. From the time we have labor force survey data in 1992 up till now, it has just fluctuated around 33, 34%. It has not improved. So that is a big question.
But why? Because you had high literacy rates, even in the tertiary sector you say, they are more or less equal. And women, in terms of gender parity in education, this has been going on since 70s. So why labor force participation would be stagnant?
So there are a lot of different reasons actually. Part of the problem is the education itself, the more, and the lack of good quality jobs. You know, the more educated you are, you don't want to just take up any job. You want a formal sector job. So when there are not so many formal sector jobs, you just prefer not to work. So that is one of the reasons, but that doesn't explain all the reasons. Actually, in Sri Lanka, of the females who are working, there is a higher proportion in the formal sector than the proportion of males in the formal sector.
Okay.
So part of the reasons is it's also, again, in Sri Lanka as in all the other countries, home production is primarily the role of females. And although we have, there are ways in which you can make home production easier, if you have electrical gadgets, or access to transport, access to other services like water, it could make your life a little bit easier. Actually, even those indicators in Sri Lanka are fairly good, about 88% have access to safe water, and about 85% houses are electrified, but it is the quality of those services. So, you need to have some regulation and changing of laws. I think that could help. Regarding parliamentary representation, I think you just have to force that, because this is the way. You have to force regulation. You have to say that you need to have so so much of females in the
So you mean quota system?
quota system, because otherwise, because all the decisions are made by males and they're not going to allow females. At least initially, I think.
Okay, at the end I will come back to this whole question, but not right now, is that, I mean, what are the women's groups and movements in Sri Lanka doing about either demanding quota system or any of this, but not right now. We'll come back to this later. I will now turn to Selima Ahmed on my right. She, as I said, she is the president of Bangladesh Women's Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And of course, I could see today that she is a very good entrepreneur, because if she had not brought her built-in audience, and she shows great enterprising skill already there. So I must say I'm very, very impressed with this. So now the question for Selima is this. Women in business in Bangladesh particularly, but also in many other countries, this is a new sort of profession, relatively new for women. Businessmen used to be men. And so I want to ask her two questions. Whether, Bangladesh government recently has taken any new initiatives she thinks has been useful in terms of promoting women in business, and if the government has not, are there some policy recommendations she can give? And the second question that often we hear in women's conferences is that why should any policies really help women rich women become richer or whatever? What are they going to do for the general masses of women or women workers? Should we not be mainly concerned about alleviating the conditions of women workers? So here again the question will be, are women as business women or as owners of industries, do they create a more women-friendly environment for working women or their own workers?
Thank you very much. Let me first thank the organizer to give me an opportunity to be here. Before I start your question, I was thinking that why this gender disparity, the word comes, and why couldn't we speak only about growth? Because we don't have any gender thinking. Till we have gender thinking, I think this gender disparity word will be eliminated, because if there was a gender thinking, then this session would not have been a parallel session. It should be in the plenary session, because this is very important issues which we need to talk about. So, and also you always see that women are listening to only women, men are not interested to hear about our issues. Now for the last few decades, as we are seeing that more women are participating in different field, because this is an effort to improve or to include inclusiveness, and the entities like ours, Bangladesh Women Chamber of Commerce, has come into being to ensure the benefits that the benefits of the inclusiveness that are enhanced and strengthened. And we have seen that lack of gender disparity and lack of inclusiveness actually miss out the potentiality of the women. Regarding the Bangladesh government, I must say that government or the politicians love to make commitments which they never make it happen, but I think we should try and advocate to make it happen. And when we formed the Women's Chamber of Commerce, and if I talk about Bangladesh, and even if we talk about women, we always think about women in a very small way, like micro women entrepreneurs, microcredit, workers. We don't think about or talk about the woman as a manager, woman as a supervisor, woman as a big industrialist. So when the chamber was formed, our one of the job was to bring more women beyond microcredit. So that I personally believe that microcredit can help for livelihood, but that cannot bring women's empowerment. So we lobbied, we said actually women entrepreneurs need higher loan, more than $500, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 or $20,000. So we lobbied to the government and we got a separate allocation by the government, and that actually really gave a huge mileage. So we can see that if there is a good policy in favor of women, women really develop. And we now 8,372 women entrepreneurs has received that loan, which has generated more than 40,000 employees. Coming back to men and women employment, I think women would like to have more women employees, but I don't think that they just go on seeing that okay, we will only employ women. One of the disparity I always feel, being a Muslim woman, I think this will always have it, because when I am born as a child of my parents, why my brother will have double the share of my property. And so this is the disparity comes from from my birth, and this is something actually we need to address. But again, in our region, the fundamentalists, the religious group will never make it happen, and whenever we speak about it, we are harassed or we face lots of violence. So the disparity is always there. But on the other hand, for that reason actually right advocacy is very important. I also would like to say that Bangladesh government, when we wanted to have, even in the national budget, we wanted to have a separate allocation, and I lobbied for consecutive 5 years, and 1 billion taka was allocated by the Bangladesh government, and out of that 16,000 women entrepreneurs will be trained within this 1 year. Then one training institute will be constructed. So government, if you go with the right advocacy, government actually don't show me the green one, I'll just see the red one. I'm already green, so I don't need to have that green one. So the government, Bangladesh government, if you can go in a right process, sometimes you can do it. But I think the mindset of men also need to be changed. I have not seen my businessmen supporting me. I have not seen that. My friend businessman from Sri Lanka supports me, but I don't find Bangladeshi businessman supports my initiative.
Bangladeshi policy maker is supporting you.
But before I get the red flag, I would like to conclude the gender disparity, one of the big issue, not only for Bangladesh, but for this region, that we need to see a democracy, the rule of law, the corruption, these actually hindrances. So we have done study on the corruption issues. Women entrepreneurs said, we don't want to make trade license, we don't want to have a teen, which is very important for the empowerment, but because of corruption, they don't want to go for it. And when there is when there is lack of democracy, a certain elite group comes up. So the inclusiveness brings actually exclude the common people, and the elite group becomes much richer, and of course the men becomes the common people are excluded, and of course women are much more excluded. So I think we need to have see that democracy exists, good governance is very important for having bringing more equality, by which I personally feel that democracy can bring more, invisible women and men visible. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Selima. Selima has raised a very important issue, which of course not only in Bangladesh but for Muslim women across the Islamic sort of world, is that it has not been possible to really get the laws, because the laws of inheritance follow Sharia laws, to get that changed. And even in all the international conferences and Beijing Platform for Action, then even the women's groups wanted women's equal share in inheritance and property, but finally, because of all the politicians, political leaders, including women political leaders, would be so afraid in all the Muslim majority countries to touch these Sharia laws, that this has not been we have not been able to really change bring the inheritance laws at par with any of the other civil laws. And I do not, in every international conference, women tried to address this particular issue but had not succeeded. I would now turn to Professor Akmal Hussein. For him, I have two questions. One, of course, Akmal comes from Pakistan, and within South Asia, we find that on many of the both economic indicators, social indicators, Pakistan has been the laggard, in some way. And what explains this? Why, in terms of all the gender indicators, Pakistan is not moving, is not making that much progress? What are really the drivers of this, that why it is not changing? Second, I think you may want to also at that point talk a little bit about the role of both social structures and culture and religion. I do not know, Selima already talked about this, whether you would want to talk about this. The second question that I have for you, and that is that one of the questions that was given to the panel was that how can you better advocate the need for addressing gender disparity with policymakers? And I thought that since you may be walking in the corridors of power and policymakers, and how do you think you would advocate this particular issue better with your policymakers? What would be more effective?
Thank you, Chair. Let me address the first question first, which is what are the factors underlying the relatively greater gender discrimination in Pakistan than compared to other South Asian countries? And the other is what can be done about it. And broadly speaking, of course, government policy is one particular part of doing something about it, but there's also something that civil society can be induced into undertaking. Why do we have relatively greater gender discrimination in Pakistan? I think there are three dimensions to this, if you like. The first, of course, is that traditional attitudes of female inferiority and females becoming the territory for conflict between men, for females' bodies becoming the battleground for conflicts between men. That kind of deeply rooted traditional attitudes are, I think, one factor. And the second, I think, factor is that in civil society and social change generally, one expects that it will move in the direction of reducing prejudice against women. But in our part of the world, unfortunately, what's happened is that powerful groups have emerged within civil society in the form, well, simplistically we call them terrorist groups. They're extremist militant groups. And they would like a return to a kind of caliphate based on their particular twisted notion of the Sharia. And in terms of their ideology and belief, these terrorist groups regard women as being one of the targets in their battle to bring a kind of caliphate about. So such groups typically are bombing schools, women. They are taking very strong action, violent action against legislators who attempt to do something about it. They are highly mobilized, they're highly armed, very well armed, and highly motivated. So this is a kind of new configuration of civil society is emerging. You know, we've been talking about civil society as being a very positive force in policy making and economic change, but here we have very powerful centers emerging in civil society who are highly retrogressive and anti-women in a sense. I think the third factor is that the government still continues to believe in a kind of conventional narrative that, and we heard a little about that in the previous session, if you like. The traditional narrative is focus on growth and don't worry about inclusion, much less inclusion of women. And in terms of that narrative, whatever government interventions are taking place or government policy making are taking place are really seen not in terms of gender mainstreaming within the process of growth, but it's seen more in terms of ameliorating the lot of the women in a limited fashion. And also often in response to donor pressures. What can we do about this? The first thing I think in terms of changing the narrative of governance, if you like, is to present the rather simple argument, and I'm surprised why this hasn't emerged earlier in Pakistan. The simple argument is that you can have a much higher rate of growth and a more sustained growth if you bring women into the mainstream of the economy, not as recipients of a trickle-down effect of growth, not in terms of income support programs like the Benazir income support program, which is a very good idea, but it's a form of handout of the government. But rather to see women as potential subjects of the growth process in terms of giving them access over capital, over productive resources, land, and therefore enable women, in that sense, empower women to engage in investment, innovation, efficiency increase, and therefore higher growth. So in that way, women would not simply be seen as victims who have to be given handouts, but as an active force, motive force in the process of growth itself. The second thing I think, which is a very practical thing, which can be done provided there's sufficient pressure internationally and within the country, and that is that the government has about, my estimate is about 3 million acres of state land, agricultural state land. And I at least have been arguing that this should be divided up into 5-acre packages and given to tenants. Now what you could do, and I think there's a sufficient reason why, sufficient basis for doing this, and that is to hand over these 5-acre packages of land to women rather than to men. So, you know, half the tenancy problem in Pakistan would be solved, but it would be solved by empowering women, you see. Now, the research that's been done in South Asia by Dr. Nisha Agarwal in the Indian case shows that women-headed households have a higher yield per acre than men-headed households in the small farm sector. So I think that's a very interesting piece of research that Nisha has done. And we can draw upon that as an argument, which is a growth and productivity argument, that if you're going to hand over land, government land, to tenants, in order to give tenants the incentive and the ability to invest and contribute to growth, then it's better to transfer it to women rather than to men. I think
But-
that's the second thing you can do.
But is there going to be some resistance, meaning you mentioned about this new emerging civil society who are very anti-women. So if the government wants to give land to poor women, are there going to be a lot of support for this, or actually there would be a group of people who would be up in arms against this
Yeah.
kind of a policy?
Yeah, this brings me to your question brings me to the third initiative that can be undertaken. But before that, just to quickly respond in the short to your point. You know, the Benazir income support program, which was basically an income transfer program, 2,000 rupees per household, per household, is actually designed to give the money to women rather than to men of a particular household. And there wasn't much resistance to that. I think people just took that. So yes, I mean, if you start handing over land to women, there may be some resistance. And that brings us to the third question, which is that at the end of the day, when we talk about empowerment of women and enabling them to get access over productive assets, over access over markets, more equitable access over markets, what we're really talking about is creating organizations of women. My experience with social mobilization in Pakistan, and indeed colleagues in India would have the same view, is that when poor people, regardless of whether they're men or women, if poor people get organized, they are able to leverage that and make that into kind of social capital, on the basis of which they're able to get access over training, increase their productivity, access over markets. And so I think encouraging or facilitating organizations of women in poor households in both the rural and the urban sector would be a very important aspect of the kind of social and economic change that we're thinking of.
Okay, thank you, Professor Akmal Hussein. I think that was we can follow up on some of this later in the discussion. Particularly, I think this very important sort of point about organization of women. I mean, at all levels, I think this collective. And she is a policy and advocacy manager at Oxfam here in Sri Lanka. And we already had a presentation from Sri Lanka, but Cyrene would talk about some special vulnerabilities, because I mean, women face discrimination generally in terms of education and health, but there are still certain categories of women or certain kinds of women in certain special situations who have double, triple jeopardy. And I think Cyrene wants to talk very specially about one particular issue that deserves priority attention in Sri Lanka, but I think not only in Sri Lanka, but I think in the region, in other countries also, this is going to be emerging as a problem. So over to you, Cyrene.
Thank you, Professor Jahan. Before I start though, I'd like to just preface my remarks with a few comments. One is a disclaimer, which is that I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer. So one of the things that struck me actually is a lack of a sort of rights conversation throughout all of these sessions. Just reflecting back on yesterday and today, and I was a bit concerned also in the last session, and I think I'd like to relate these two preparatory comments to that last session, because after all, this is a session that springs from that. And I was a little concerned when Professor Anish Chowdhury was talking about moving the discourse from inequalities to vulnerabilities, because I think there is a risk of losing that whole idea of rights, because after all, economic, social, cultural rights are rights as much as civil and political rights. So I think I'd like to keep that framework in mind in all of our conversations. And the other is the issue of governance, which Selima very rightly pointed out, because I think in some of the presentations in the earlier session, I think Vaka very nicely gave a comprehensive sort of overview of the inequalities in growth. But some of his analysis, I think, and I went up to him afterwards and I mentioned this because I didn't want to raise it in plenary, there was no time, but they mask differences across countries. So if you take his analysis of power centers, for instance, things like superior judiciary, ascendance of the media, supremacy of parliament, they may be the case for certain countries in our region, but not for others. So I think that is something that we need to bear in mind, and again it ties in with women's empowerment and the whole issue of the need for proper governance and proper regulation if you are going to move forward with women and empowering them economically. The specific area that I wanted to actually talk about was the vulnerabilities of women in conflict-affected areas, which is something that particularly affects Sri Lanka, and I think also ties in with my area of work with Oxfam, because we do work with vulnerable communities across the country, not only the north and east, but also elsewhere, and particularly work on gender justice issues. But before going into that, I'd like to touch briefly on some of the points that Nisha made and maybe elaborate a little bit on that, because we had Professor Hassan talking about, the simple point that, bringing women into the growth process will simply increase growth, and why don't we, make that argument? And I totally agree with you, but I think we need to go behind some of the obstacles to this, and it's not often, evident on the surface why this is. So I think one big area is childcare. If the lack of alternative care facilities for women for their children means that they are very reluctant to go into the workforce. They may be in the informal sector, but even to go into the informal sector, it can be quite difficult. I think, and it's not just about, you give childcare facilities and then women go into the workforce, because it's also about, and this is something we face even in our work with Oxfam. So we give, we skill women, we give them training, we try to compel them to come to training programs, which is then going to make them able to have a small enterprise or something that will give them financial stability. But even to come to a training program, they need to look at the whole aspect of childcare. And then we come into it with all of our child safeguard policies saying, if you bring a child to a training program, you have to have a child safe space, and then how do you do that? Or you can't travel with a child in a three-wheeler more than 20 kilometers because the child will fall out of the three-wheeler. So, all of these things are behind the whole issue of why women, don't maybe acquire the skills that are necessary to get into the labor force, and if so, why they don't then participate. I think, again, you need to go even behind that, and if the deeper you dig, you kind of, how far do you go back? But one of the big issues facing our society today, and I think it's the same in the rest of South Asia, is the whole question of child abuse and exploitation. So if you look at the way the family dynamics work, it is a responsibility of the mother to ensure the child's protection. So it's not just about actual physical care for the child, but if you leave a child of anything between 8 and even 16 years at home, you're going to be then responsible to what happens to the child. So I think we can't divorce the kind of social problems and the cultural problems that we are facing from women's economic empowerment. Then I think Nisha and a couple of other people touched on the issue of domestic violence. So we have some studies like in Kerala that show, for instance, of the women who suffer intimate partner violence, that is violence by the husband or male partner, about a quarter of them, there's some very recent research done actually by CARE on this, about a quarter of them had to stay in bed as a result of the violence. About 16% had to take days off work, and about 32% had to go for medical treatment. So, and you have to remember that 32% may be much higher because women are often reluctant to go for treatment to a medical facility when it is an injury caused by violence in the home. Another issue on which we don't have a lot of data is the whole issue of sexual harassment within the workplace. And we have a little bit of work done on it and possibly not enough. And these are all, I think, barriers to women going into work. With regard to the political participation, I think Nisha and others have spoken on it, and I think it is a difficult and a complex issue. I think there we also need to realize that there's a kind of a sort of a converse situation there where Sri Lanka is one of the countries with the lowest political participation of women in South Asia, and yet our human development indicators are very high. Whereas it's a converse. In the rest of South Asia, you have much higher political participation by women due mainly to the quota system, and yet the indicators are very low. So what I'm trying to get at is it might not be a silver bullet that you increase political participation and you will have women in the labor force. Going into the situation of women in the conflict-affected areas, I mean, I just want to highlight a few of the obstacles that are facing them very quickly. I mean, one is, of course, the whole issue of lack of education. And we have like a whole generation of women whose education was interrupted, who do not have the training and the skills to go into livelihood, which means that they are even more vulnerable than other women in the rest of the country. We also have issues regarding return and relocation. So, for instance, if women who lived, who sort of lived in the coastal areas, and a lot of their livelihood was to do with netting and to do with the fisheries industry. If you relocate them in an area which is mainly which is inland, as is happening, in the north and east, then you have to, it's just being very gender sensitive in your whole policies to do with internal displacement and relocation. If I can have one more minute,
yes,
one or maybe two. We also have the whole issue of the kind of the post-war construct or reconstruction of the woman when it comes to giving her giving her employment options. So if you have a situation where you have a whole lot of ex-combatants, giving them training in beauty parlor may not be the most appropriate. You might want to give them training, you might want to make them sports trainers instead. And I think that is lacking, and we have situations where we've heard of women being brought from the north and given training in preschool education and then sent back to a place where there's nothing, including a preschool. So that you need to match what training you're giving them with what they can actually do when they get back to where they go for. We also have, a lot of the women moved during the war into the agricultural sector and into wage labor. So you need to look at, women ready to do maybe more unconventional types of work post-war than they may have been before. Another issue is in a lot of women's work related to use of forest resources, and now they go back and they can't use them either because of mines or because of deforestation or because of declaration of areas as protected areas. So because of all the changes in the situation of women and in the locations that they return to, you find that there's a lot of kind of complexity in giving livelihood options. Finally, I'd just like to touch upon the whole issue of insecurity of women and leading to lots of very inappropriate and kind of practices which really shouldn't be encouraged. So due to the fact that many women have now become widows, we have something like 89,000 widows in the north and the east. And many of them have maybe 6, very, very large families to look after. We have this whole practice of transactional sex where women don't enter into sex work, but they enter into relationships which end up being exploitative simply because they need to care for their children. So I think these are some very negative trends that we need to look at reversing. What we should do in the future, I think we have had a lot of suggestions. I think
just one suggestion.
So when I was looking at this concept note for this summit, I saw that one of your main kind of advocacy points was to link with the SAARC process. So I think if there's some way that we can influence a SAARC platform on, for instance, political participation. We heard about targets yesterday, that it's not important just to say we need to get them, we need to have targets. So if we can have a consensus on, say, political participation, but not just pay lip service to it, say by this year, we want to have so many women parliamentarians or so many women in local politics. I think that would be one way to go.
Thank you very much, Cyrene. I think you made some very good points, but I think one that I think was very useful, and now that I see someone here, I think you might not have heard that. What she found is missing was very much, it was more economic tricks, I mean, that kind of a talk. But these days in anything on development, we have a lot of rights-based approach, and there was not that much of a conscious, I mean, you had whenever you talk about disparity or inclusive growth, you probably assume that there should be a rights-based approach. So, but that was consciously given. I think I would now open up the floor for questions or comments, all for 1 or 2 minutes, and please give your name. Yes, Saiduzaman. Yes. I will give preference first to all the male in the audience to ask questions, since they have been sitting here very patiently, and they are a minority, an excluded group by their own choice, often not by ours. So I give preference to all the male in the audience. Saiduzaman.
Thank you very much. I am Siriwardhana from Bangladesh. I must say that I enjoyed the discussions very much, and it was very educative for me, the answers to the questions that you posed to the discussers, especially the situation in Kerala and the situation in Sri Lanka about women's participation in politics. These are really educative to me. I was not aware of this situation. Having said that, I have 2 questions, one to Professor Akmal and one to Selima Ahmed. My question to Professor Akmal is that your idea of this distribution of government caste lands to women, 5 acres each, has it actually happened, or it's still an idea? Because my understanding was that in some states, particularly in Sindh, 2-acre plots have been given to women. But there the problem is that these acre packets have been given without any support or resources to exploit those land. So unless government, it comes as a package with supporting resources for exploiting that land and giving the land to make agricultural production out of it, it will be meaningless. So is anything being done on that? And my question to Selima Ahmed is that in our parliament, when the constitution was promulgated in early 73 in Bangladesh, there was a 10% seats reserved for women in the parliament. 300 members plus another 30 women.
No, 10. It was 15, then moved up to 30, then 45, now 50.
It is 15%. 50, little more than 15%. My question is that what do the Women Entrepreneurs Association, Chamber of Commerce and Industry, or the Jatiya Mohila Parishad, which is the leading women's organization, think about this reservation of quota? Do they think that this is given only because of political connections, or also on the basis of competence and merit? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, the panelists would answer later. I will take the questions first. Yeah, yes, here.
Arif Zaman from the Commonwealth Business Council. I just want to encourage also, there was a reference to SARC being a lever. Well, I think actually with 5 SARC members in the Commonwealth, we should look at the Commonwealth as being a lever. And Selima was part of a meeting just 2 months ago in Dhaka, where we presented ways around economic empowerment for women. We presented this to women ministers across 30 countries from the Commonwealth, face to face. I just want to say in a minute what those 3 levers are, because I think they're significant, and we haven't had a focus on that. I just come from a meeting of women parliamentarians all across the Commonwealth, and this is exactly a topic. So one of those levers is looking at women on boards and in senior decision-making roles. That's not to belittle the challenges from women at the other end of the spectrum, but increasingly we're seeing interventions from changes in corporate governance, requirements and roles. We're looking at new structures, we're looking at new business startups, and I think there's certainly, there's a major report which has just come out from the ACCA and the Commonwealth which gives concrete examples in the Maldives, in India and Pakistan and other parts of the Commonwealth of what the barriers are, what the business case is, and how it actually has an impact on business performance, which was exactly where the focus should be. So I think women on boards and in senior decision-making roles is one area. The second area is procurement. In terms of giving women access to supply chains, one of the areas that we've identified very clearly is procurement. What did the Kenyan government do in April of this year? 30% of government contracts are now available to women-owned businesses. That's the kind of model that we could look at for government procurement. There's private sector procurement, there's the Commonwealth Games, big sporting events as well, and there's also what we're now looking at is an e-commerce platform for women across the Commonwealth to enable women in a Pacific island or in a rural part of Bangladesh to be part of that global supply chain. And then the third area is the more familiar one of access to finance, but we also feel that access to skills is as important indeed as well. And I think looking at those ways, I think that very much supports Akmal Saab's point around seeing women not as victims, but as positive economic drivers of growth and contributors to growth. I just want to share this one anecdote briefly in 30 seconds. One of the discussion points in Dhaka, when we had 30 ministers around the table, whether they were from Guyana, whether they were from Rwanda, or whether they were from Bangladesh or Australia, was what really got women ministers excited and interested was the impact of getting women in from the workforce and the impact on economic growth. That was what really got them sparked and interested. And I think we need to recalibrate the conversation and refocus on that dimension rather than the women as victims and the handouts. And I think that's where the trend is going. And in this room, in this building, I should say in 10 weeks, we have a real opportunity because it's in this place we will have the Commonwealth Summit. In this very building, and we're certainly working hard to ensure the Commonwealth is there. So I just want to put those ideas to the panel. Selima, I know you were part of that meeting in Dhaka, and I think that those are concrete examples of economic empowerment rather than the list of problems and the list of victims and problems that we've often hearing.
Okay, thank you. Yes, here.
We also need green flags.
Thank you. Matthew Hamill from UNSCAP, South and Southwest Asia office. I just wanted to raise a couple of points. Just this, I mean, obviously the panelists have raised a bunch of issues regarding gender inequality and women's economic empowerment and women's empowerment overall. But I mean, the issue of, in this region, labor market segmentation, I think, is one of the key barriers to women's economic empowerment, apart from, of course, entrepreneurship and enterprise development in managerial positions. But so making the argument that we've had the second day of a 3-day conference about South Asia and South Asia's economic development, we're talking about growth, and we have one parallel session on gender disparities. But I think this conversation about entering how the greater participation of women in the economy can provide benefits for economic growth, can provide greater spillovers for growth in terms of greater social protection, greater employment elasticities. This, I think, would be an area that a lot of work could be done to leverage one of the arguments for greater women's participation in the labor force. The second one being there seems to be a disconnect in this region between education and work. So the higher education links and then the transition into the workforce. This is in contrast to a lot of other regions. But the informality argument with the labor market segmentation, I think, ties into that. And the third thing I wanted to touch on, which was only touched on very briefly by the panelists, but is I guess, the elephant in the room, is men's participation in unpaid work. And no one is talking about that. Now, if you want women to participate in the labor force, we talked about childcare issues, we talked about perhaps how to provide that through government service. You can create a market for it, which developed countries do. But what about men's participation in unpaid work? How are you going to get equality across all sectors of paid and unpaid work? That's what I'd like to see.
Thank you. Yes, here. Just give your name.
Thank you very much. I'm Archana Bhatnagar. I'm the president for the Madhya Pradesh Association of Women Entrepreneurs in Jabalpur. I have my own business also. I've been a first generation entrepreneur for over 35 years. So having said that, what I feel is just a very positive note that from India's perspective, we had a more research perspective. But surely, I feel that having interacted with people over the last 2 days, the Indian policies need a little more showcasing where entrepreneurship or business support is coming. And I feel that these are the positive sides of what assistance we get for marketing development assistance, for entrepreneurship, for finance, many, many things, which the government is there. I wouldn't go into the details, but only would like to encapsulate that there are many, many things coming in, and there should be an opportunity to showcase those positive policies to other governments, whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's Pakistan, whether it is Sri Lanka, Nepal. And I'm very sure that policymakers are affected by positive things that are happening, and especially being the South Asia region, the SAARC region, it would affect it. Secondly, yes, there is a point that a woman, when she enters business, if she fails once, she is forbidden to take the risk another time. Now that is something that we all need to think about. A woman will never be given a second chance to prove herself on anything, whether it's high, mid, or low levels, whereas men can get umpteen number of chances. So that is a thought provocation that needs. Challenges are always there, whether it's access to finance. Even in India, there may be schemes of the Reserve Bank of India which go down to the bankers. We keep fighting with the bankers. They'll hide those schemes under the tables so that they don't have to deliver with micro cases. So in all, I feel it's a positive thing that's happening in India, a positive atmosphere, and we'd like to share many more things in the future.
Yes, I will go on that side. Yes. Yeah, I will. Yeah.
I'm Mrs. Arunathilake I'm the president of the Business and Professional Women Sri Lanka. I founded Business and Professional Women Sri Lanka 20 years ago, and we have survived with many obstacles. The main thing I would like to say is, in Sri Lanka and various other countries, you talked about a quota system for politicians. Whatever the quota is, it's very difficult for a woman to get into politics because there is so much violence. So much violence. That is why whatever the quota system is, women are hesitant to get into politics because of the violence. A men can stand it, but a woman definitely not. She is torn into shreds and kicked into the drain if she tries to come out. In business, it is the same. As the lady from India stated, if you are a woman, you try to go up in business. If you go to a bank, you are not treated as a businesswoman at all. You are just treated as a sex object. And the man asks you for a cup of coffee, then wants to come home and wants to find out what your husband is doing. And it is very, very difficult to get up there. I have fought very hard to get where I have got. My husband used to manufacture yachts to the international market. I took it upon myself to do so, but it is so difficult to work in a men's atmosphere. So we can talk till the cows come down or whatever you say. We have to change the attitude of men. That is the most important thing. Today, in this climate, you can't even go to a man minister. You are asked to come for a cup of tea, or he asks you right after you go home, can I come and see you at home? It is impossible. You can't go for a visa, you can't go for a bank loan, you can't become a politician, you can't do anything as a woman unless you start getting to the men to make up their minds to treat women on an equal platform. Otherwise, we can talk and talk till next birth. It will never happen.
Thank you very much. Oh, there was nobody here from Nepal on the panel, and I wonder whether amongst the audience we have any Nepalese.
We have Nepalese.
So yes, the floor is yours. Yes.
No, she's not Nepali. The behind is the Hindi
Yeah.
mein bolo, I will translate it in Hindi. Hindi mein bolo.
The question is, I'm Mrs. Siriwardhana. I am the president of the Women's Chamber of Commerce, Central Province, and I also run a newspaper company in Kandy. My question is actually to research in Kerala, because we were taken to Kerala once on a study tour, and we studied the Kudumbashri program, because I saw how women have been empowered through that program. We met many, 2 or 3 mayors who are really, and some women who are leading business. So we thought that when women are empowered like that, I mean, they could resist violence, you know. So, but how can you explain that? But here I see the indicators are very low. That's my question.
Thank you. Okay, here and then we will come. How many more hands? Then, because I have to give chance to the panelists also to respond. So you, and then we will take then the last question here from Nepal. Yes, or comment.
Well,
Your
I
name?
would just, I'm Rajni Agrawal. I'm representing an organization called Federation of Indian Women Entrepreneurs, which is a pan-India organization in India. And one thing which I would like to tell to Dr. Aradhna Agrawal, that we recently opened a chapter in Kerala. It's a college called Assumption College, where 22 girls are studying and 800 girls are staying in hostel there around. And the principal of that college has become our chapter in charge in Kerala. So, and the reasons are, you know, she said that because they had just recently attended our 12th global conference, and she has sent 2-3 women who are consultants from her college for exposure purpose, and then after that the chapter was opened there. I found that they are very eager to come out, but the social systems are really, really very difficult. People do not want their girls to come out of the house, so they are not able to do anything about it. That's the biggest challenge for them. Secondly, what my friend sitting here, he has suggested about the, you know, the supplies to the government, you know. I had presented a paper to the government in India about 5 years back, and luckily the National Small Scale Industries Corporation, they have bring out you know, sort of proposal, and it has been already declared by Ministry of MSME, that whatever supplies goes to the government of India, whether it is defense, whether it is railway, whether it is all other government bodies, there should be a 10% supply from women entrepreneur. And let me tell you, I think each and every country has huge supplies to the government, to the corporates. And even if we get 10 to 15% share out of it, I'm sure all the women can really do very well. But the point is this, that women has to also take a lot of initiatives to come forward to the mainstream. You know, simply sitting at our chairs and talking about mainstreaming is not going to help, because ultimately business is business, and all has to take the same initiatives like men are doing. So we are also equally responsible for our situations, you know. So we have to really look into that as well. The women who have come forward, they have been able to do it because they had the guts and the fire in them. So I'll really appreciate if we could bring all other women also along with us at the same platform. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. With that can be, this conversation will be taken over tea. You want the panel to, then I think I will not take the, I have what, 5 minutes to wrap up the panel, or 7 minutes or so. Do you want to say anything in Hindi? You can. I think most people understand. You can just speak in Hindi. I think most people will follow. In Nepal.
मैं सृजनी टुलाटर नेपाल से नेफिन से आई हूँ। इधर नेपाल में लड़की लोगों का काम करने के लिए थोड़ा मुश्किल ही है। बिजनेस में ज़्यादा ऊपर नहीं आ सकते, क्योंकि हस्बैंड सब बैंक में लेने के लिए भी हस्बैंड का सब परमिट लेना चाहिए, और इसीलिए हम लोग बिग बिजनेस नहीं कर सकते।
Okay, thank you. Let me now get back to the panel in the same order, and just in 1 minute, if you want to address any one of these issues. And one thing, because I will not wrap it up, I think for a long time, women really have advocated and taken this position that, you know, the saying that they are victims, that is not taking them anywhere. So, but that doesn't mean that you would not still identify some of the problems you face and how to address that. So if you somehow got the impression that here in this panel we were projecting a victimhood kind of a attitude, I think that was not the purpose, because but the point is that women also feel very strongly that women are citizens and they have rights, and that just arguing in a very instrumental way, that previously it was welfare, now it is, oh, if you want growth, we are cheap labor and we can push your economy. That also is not the right. We are 50% of the population and we are 50% of the citizens, and we have some rights, and that is how I think women would like to argue. Okay, over to you.
Yeah, actually I would like to take up this question on labor market, and this is also something in response to what she was talking about on the labor market participation of women. In fact, in Kerala the situation is just in contrast. There the labor market participation in urban areas is the highest in India, but at the same time workforce participation rate is the lowest. So unemployment rate is very high. So that actually indicates that there is a lot of labor market discrimination, which is happening. In rural areas again we have the problem of very high unemployment rate in Kerala. So which means that women are willing to work, but perhaps they are not given that kind of they don't or they get discriminated against in the labor market. So this is something which we must keep in mind. That sexual violence is happening. This is because of the social norms. Actually, though women are educated, they are aspiring to become something, but in fact, social norms are such that they are not really allowed to do that, and perhaps that leads to frustration and domestic violence. In fact, I have been to Kerala every month over the last 1 year, and I find that they simply say the women who are good, they don't get out of their homes after 7 o'clock. So I am very particular about being in the hotel in the evening. So it is something. These social and cultural norms are something. And I made up a presentation to students, and these were the professional students, and these women came to me and they said that we see you as a role model, because in Kerala we cannot really be so bold and so forthcoming and making presentations like that. So that was something that the young generation was telling me that. So that was really very, very worrisome, let me tell you. And yes, empowerment is absolutely important, and that's what our study shows, that their position actually, is directly related with economic empowerment, and something is to be done. And yes, procurement, but the procurement problem, there is a problem, and now we have 30% reservation for small scale industries in government procurement. Even those norms are not met. So perhaps, when you go for that, you target the small segment, the small industry, because the large industry segment cannot be targeted in that procurement. So you may be, in fact, I'm going to argue for that. I'm making a presentation to Montex, our planning commission, and that is about this only, that in startups they should be given, because there are now schemes which are coming up to promote startups. So we want really some sort of reservations to women.
Anuradha, because there are others here.
There is so much of overlapping of schemes.
That conversation can be taken up later.
So
Akmal, there were some specific question that was raised with you.
Very quickly, I'm afraid I'm the culprit who proposed the idea of giving government land and 5-acre packages to tenants. That was 5 years ago. But just to show you how right Eliot was, between the idea and reality falls the shadow. In this case, it's the shadow of a particular kind of power structure. That originally, if you see the paper, it does exactly what you suggested, which is that it proposes not only that 5-acre packages be given to the tenants, but to also set up a national small farmer development corporation, in which each of the small farmers who have received the land would be members or shareholders of that corporation, and that corporation would then provide to small farmers 3 kinds of services. One is the development of the land itself. make it capable of being properly cultivated. Second, to arrange for more efficient sort of irrigation, to improve application efficiencies on the land. And thirdly, to bring to them new technologies through which they could go into high value added crops. Now what happened in practice was that I had the opportunity to meet the president on this issue, President Zardari at the time, because I was a member of the panel of economists. And so when I suggested the idea to him, he was excited because he thought there was a political gain to be made, but didn't want to go through this. The second, which was an essential part of the program of providing services to farmers, he just started handing out small packages of land, initially in Sindh. To some extent, it's also happened in the Punjab, but mainly so far, whatever land has been handed over to actually People's Party supporters, but who happen to be small farmers in the Sindh province. So that's the story.
Okay. So